Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section and the next we're going to look more closely at the use of expressions. I've used a couple of expressions already on the course, and not only is the use of expressions a very important skill in Access, but it's also quite an extensive subject area. We're just going to look at a couple of examples on the course, and then hopefully as your requirements for expressions grows, you'll look into the help and you'll experiment with the facilities that are there and develop the use of expressions to make them a very important part of your tool set when you're working with Access 2016. Now earlier on we had one or two examples of adding validation for fields. And in this copy of the Night Movies Exercise 7 database, I've opened the ACT table, and at the moment, although we have a born date and a died date for actors, we have no validation on the born date. And what I'm going to do now is to add validation to the born date of an actor. And the first thing we're going to say is that for any actors that are going to appear in this database, they won't have been born before, say, 1880. Now, some of the old classic movies, there may have been one or two actors and actresses born earlier than that, but let's take that as the earliest year in which any of these actors and actresses may have been born. Now, if I was talking about a year of birth, the validation greater than or equal to 1880 would be straightforward enough. But when I'm dealing with a date, I need to put in validation against a date. And working with dates is one aspect of working with expressions, which is a very important one to get to grips with early on. So let's make sure that all of our actors and actresses weren't born before 1880. The born date field is selected in the actor table. I'm going to go down to the validation rule, and at the right hand end there is 3 dots, the ellipsis marker, that brings up the expression builder. And the expression builder basically includes a main panel at the top in which we build an expression, and then below that, in this case, we have 3 panels. We have an expression elements panel, an expression categories panel, and an expression values panel. And if I want to build an expression up, I can build it in the upper panel using components from the lower panels. Now, in the early stages, you may well use the panels to help you to build up your expressions. But after you've been doing this for a while, you may also find that you can pretty much type into the upper panel the expression that you want without great reference to those lower 3 panels. And even beyond that, you may get to the point when it comes to entering, for example, a validation rule, that you can type it straight into the validation rule row in the general properties section at the bottom of a table definition. But for the moment, let's build this one up using those 3 lower panels just to get the hang of those. So our basic requirement to begin with is that the born date is no earlier than 1880. What that actually means, since we're dealing with a date, is that the date is greater than or equal to January the 1st, 1880. Or perhaps we could say greater than December the 31st, 1879. Now that requirement, that expression, is in 2 parts. First of all, there is an operator. And the operator in this case will be greater than or equals to or greater than. And if you look at the first of the lower panels, expression elements, one section there is operators. When you select operators, you see the expression categories for operators in the middle. Now the sort of operator we're looking for here is a comparison operator, and they include operators like less than or equal to, not equal to, and so on. There are also arithmetic expressions such as plus, times, divided by, and there are logical operators such as and, or, and not, and there is one string operator which is the ampersand operator, which in Access, when you're handling strings, means concatenate, join two strings together. So in this case, the operator we want is one of those comparison operators, and let's choose greater than or equal to. Double click that and it appears as the first part of the expression. The second part of the expression will be the operand, the thing that the operator is operating on, which in this case needs to be the date, January the 1st, 1880. Now there's something special about dates in Access 2016 expressions, but for the moment I'm just going to type in there 1/1/1880, representing the date January the 1st, 1880. Now watch what happens when I click on OK. That appears as my validation rule there, but the date is actually enclosed between hash symbols. And the way that you denote a date constant in Access 2016 is to enclose it between hash symbols. If you type a date in as we just did, and Access recognizes that you mean that to be a constant date, it will put the hash symbols in for you. But if I were to type that expression in a situation where it wouldn't be clear to Access that that was a date, then it might not put the hash symbols in, and in that case a certain amount of confusion or possibly even chaos will ensue. So when you are putting constant dates in, or date constants, you can actually use either expression, I suggest that you always put the hash symbols in yourself to make it absolutely clear to Access that what you're dealing with here is a date. So we have here our first version of this validation rule, and that is that born date is greater than or equal to January the 1st, 1880. But that's not really going to be a good enough validation rule for me, because I also want to make sure that we don't accidentally or even deliberately put in a date in the future. An actor could have a born date of today. I do believe that there have been movies with newborn babies in them that have been credited, but I'm going to say that actually when we enter or modify a born date, not only must it be no earlier than January the 1st, 1880, but it must be no later than today. Now the problem with that is that I could put today's date in. I could put in May the 9th, 2016, but of course in a couple of weeks' time that's no longer today. In fact, tomorrow it's no longer today. So what I really want to do is to put something in for the other part of the validation rule, which will deal with an expression like today rather than a specific constant date. Well, the good news is that I can do that in Access 2016. So I'm going to invoke the expression builder again, and I'm going to completely change my validation rule and say not that the date must be greater than or equal to that date, January 1st, 1880, but that it must be between two dates. Now if I go back to the operators here and look at comparison, one of the options in comparison was between. So I'm now going to click at the beginning of the expression. I'm going to delete the operator that I had, which was greater than or equal to, and I'm going to double click between. Now notice that when I do that, Access 2016 puts in sort of dummy values for me for the two expressions that I want to use. So it says between one expression and another expression. Now I know what the first expression is because it's January the 1st, 1880, so I'm going to cut that using the keyboard shortcut Control X. I'm going to click on the first expression and paste my cut value in as the first date in my between dates. But for the other date, I need to use one of the Access functions. And in fact, if you click on functions there, one of the options is built-in functions. And the built-in functions are categorized. We have conversion functions, date and time functions, financial, general, inspection, math, text. Now this is a date and time function. There are a lot of date functions, and you may look at those and say, well, which one of them tells me today's date? If you look at the bottom part of the Expression Builder dialog, as you click on each of those functions, you get a brief description of what each function does. And the third one of those is returns a variant of type date containing the current system date. So that means today. Now, one obvious potential flaw in this, of course, is if the date on your computer is set wrongly. But let's assume that you've got the date set correctly on your computer, and that expression will give you today's date. Click on OK, and now my validation rule says that a born date should be between the 1st of January 1880 and today. And that will be today whenever you are actually applying the validation rule. Now let me put some validation text in. Okay. Then I'm going to save that information, and let's take our new validation rule for a test drive. Let's try Morgan Freeman's date of birth. June the 1st, 1937. Let me first of all try 1837. No. What about 2037? No. What about tomorrow? It's May the 9th at the moment, so if I make that May the 10th, 2016. No. May the 9th. Yep, so that's good. I'll just put that back the way that it was. So there we are. My new validation rule seems to be doing the job. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to continue looking at expressions in Access 2016. In the preceding section I showed you how to set up a more complex validation rule than we've seen before. In this section we're going to actually do a calculation using an expression, and we're going to use it to populate a field on a form which is not a field that's stored in any of the records, in any of the tables in the database. Now I'm looking at the trip tour form in the Esprit de Tour database, and this is actually used as a subform on the trip maintenance form, and this is the one where we list all of the tours that are currently available. Now at the moment there are three pieces of information in a row in the trip tour subform. There's a start date, an adult price and a child price. And what I want to display is the end date for the tour. So first of all I'm going to make a space for the end date, so I'm going to make the form a little wider, and I'm going to move 4 of the controls on the subform to the right. I can adjust this more accurately later, and then whereas I have a start date here which is bound to the control source start date, what I want is an end date. I'll calculate it by adding the trip duration to the start date of this tour. So the first thing I need to do is to add a control for the end date. The start date has a type of text box, so for the end date I'm going to use a type of text box as well. Now if you look at this control in the controls on the Form Design Tools Design tab, it's the one that you can use to add a text box. So I'm going to draw it on the subform. Note that by default it is unbound. We'll deal with that in a moment. If you look at the start date field, let's click on all. The name of the control is start date. Let's be consistent and let's call this control not text3 but end date. Note that this is the name of the control. It's got nothing to do with where we get the data from. Now the label for start date is currently label 0, not the sort of name that I normally like, so I'm going to make it start date label, and the caption is start date. Let me change that to start space date. And now let me take the label for the end date control, and I'm going to call that end date label, and the caption is going to be end space date. And I'm going to just move that label over to be closer to its text box. Okay, and then I'm going to change the alignment to be right aligned. Now everything else in terms of tab order, sizes, alignments, etc. we'll come back to a little bit later on. Let's now go back into the end date text box and look at the question of the control source. We're going to put something in there, but what is the something that we're going to put in there? Well, what I need to do is to take the start date for this tour and add to it the duration of the trip. Now bear in mind that all of the tours that appear in a subform with this one are all for the same trip, and the duration of the trip is going to be in the trip maintenance form. Another point to bear in mind is that I don't simply add the number of days to the start date, because in fact if it's an 8-day tour, for example, what I really need to do is to add the 8 and then take one off, because an 8-day tour, to get from start date to end date, you actually add the number of nights, which is one less than the number of days. So if it were a 2-day tour, you would only add 1 to the start date to get the end date, for example. So the formula is start date plus duration minus 1. Now at this point it's a very good idea to consider where you're going to get all the information you need from. The start date is available in the subform here, but the duration isn't. It's in the trip maintenance form, and in fact you could get it from the trip maintenance form. But a more compact and self-contained way of doing this is to make the duration of the trip available directly to the form itself. If I select the whole form, the trip tour subform, the record source is the table tour. So effectively I get all of the fields in the tour table. So I get all of the tour information. What if instead of getting that, I get all of that plus the duration of the trip, of which this tour is an instance? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the record source for the whole form. It's currently table tour, so it's a tour record. If I go into the query builder, I still need the tour information, so I'm going to select star from table tour, but I'm also going to show table trip, and I'm going to get the duration in days from the corresponding trip table record. So now the source for my form will be a query. Now let's go back to that end date, and what we need in that end date now is an expression that takes the value of the start date, adds the duration in days, which is not visible on the form but is available to it, and subtracts 1. We want the start date. We're going to add. Now we look at the field list here. We've got duration days, and we're going to subtract 1. Now strictly speaking, when it comes to manipulating dates, adding, subtracting dates and so on, it's usually safest to use specific date handling functions. But provided you take 1 or 2 precautions, which I'm about to show you, you can normally make this work without using the date handling functions. There is, for example, a date add function that enables you to add a certain number of units, days or weeks or months, to a given date to get a different date. But let's try start date plus duration days minus 1. Click on OK. And then for the format of the end date field, we want it to be the same format as the start date, which is short date. Let's close and save that. And let's take a look at trip maintenance now. Now you notice that this first trip, which is the Grand Canyon and Family Rafting Adventure, is an 8-day trip. And at the moment the start date for that one is May the 12th, 2017. The end date is May the 19th. So that's a week later, that's 8 days, that's fine. Let's look at the next trip. This is a 13-day trip. Starts on June the 11th, finishes on June the 23rd. That looks pretty good to me, actually. Now, as I mentioned, I would now go in and tidy up all the alignment. Notice how my prices are now lost off the right of the subform there. Let me do that next, do a little bit of tidying up. So I've done a certain amount of tidying up there. Once again, I wouldn't actually align all this completely accurately until I was sure that there was no more to do on it at the moment. So we've seen a couple of examples of how to use expressions in Access 2016. I'm sure you're going to be using expressions a lot from now on. For the moment, that's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to start to look at one of the very strong features of Access, and that is the use of reports. Many people's interaction with a database is usually based on the use of forms. And one or two very important features of forms is that they tend to be an interactive way of using a database. And the information you are accessing and using is usually current, and often you're accessing that information with, if you like, a sense of urgency. When it comes to reports, however, the situation is often quite different. Reports are very often used for things like summarizing information in databases. And the sort of question you might ask a database would be something like, how many orders did we have last month? Or make a list of all the movies that Harrison Ford appeared in between 1990 and 2000. Very often reports are printed or saved as files for later reference. So quite often reports are not associated with immediacy and urgency, and usually when you're looking at a report you need to bear in mind that this is a snapshot of how things were at a particular point in time, and that things may well have moved on since then. Having said that, there are many situations where a report is what you need, the ideal way of maybe summarizing the information that you need. So let's take a look at how you make and use reports in Access 2016. In this section we're going to build a very simple report using the report wizard, and I'm going to talk about some of the tools for handling reports. And then in the next section we will build a more complex report and we'll look at some of the specific report design tools. The first report that I'm going to make is a report of the countries that are in the Esprit de Tour database, and it's going to be an extremely simple report. It's basically just going to list the countries. My navigation pane looks a little bit empty at the moment. That's only because I've got the categories collapsed. It's a good idea if you have a report based on a specific table, or mostly on a specific table, to select that table first. So in this case I'm going to select the country table and then click Create. I'm going to go to the Report Wizard. Now in the country table, of course, we have a single field, and as usual with a wizard field picker, I look at the available fields on the left, there is only one, and move the field or fields to the list on the right using the arrows in the middle. So that's a pretty easy job to do on this occasion. Click on Next. Now, given that I may have many different fields in a report, what order, what sort order do I want for my records? Now, I only have countries, so in this case it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to do it in country sequence ascending. If I said none, of course, the countries would appear in whatever sequence they are stored in the country table. Now, when it comes to layout, there are two main choices for layout. You can have tabular layout, that's the default here, and basically what happens here is the layout is like a spreadsheet. So each row on the report will be one item in the report, whereas with columnar layout the columns flow as with a newspaper, for example. So depending on the number of columns in the report, the information about one record, in this case one country, will go down the page in the first column, down the page in the second column, etc. Now on this occasion I'm going to go for the tabular layout. I can also choose whether I would like portrait orientation or landscape orientation. I'm going to use portrait orientation, and particularly if you have a lot of fields to fit, say across the page, there's a checkbox at the bottom here. Adjust the field width so all fields fit on a page. Now with only the country field in use, I don't think we're going to have trouble fitting them across the page. So I don't really need that checkbox checked, but on the other hand it's not going to do any harm, so I'm going to leave it checked. Now click on Next. What title do you want for your report? I'm going to call it. Prefix for reports for me is RPT, countries. And now it says, do you want to preview the report or do you want to modify the report's design? On this occasion I want to preview the report. And there it is, there's the list of countries in the country table in a portrait format report. Now generally speaking, where you have a tabular report, the default style is for alternate rows to be shaded to make it easier to read across the report. Now of course in this case where we only have a single field, that is the country name itself, reading across is not a particular problem. But you'll often find that that alternate shaded rows style does make it easier to read reports. Now one thing you'll notice here is that we go straight into print preview mode, and we actually have the print preview tab on the ribbon selected. Let's go through the main groups on the print preview tab. And as you're looking at this, think of the single sheet that you can see there with RPT countries at the top as a sheet of paper. Now on the left we have the print group. You can click on print here. That will take you into a print dialog where you can print this report out straight away. I'm going to talk about printing a little bit later on, but basically if you make a report now and do want to print it, you have the names of your available printers here. Mine defaults to printing to PDF, but I have of course a physical printer, have a fax device, I can write it to a Microsoft XPS document, or I can send it to OneNote. The list of options you have here will depend on your own installation and your own device to know what's available to you in terms of printing. So one or two of the items in this list that you have may be the same as mine, one or two of them may well be different. But if all you wanted to do now was to print this report, it's pretty straightforward. Select the printer, select the number of copies, the number of pages you want to print. In this case we only have one page, so that's not a lot of choice. And then depending on the number of copies and the number of pages, you may want to specify whether you want the copies collated or not. I'm not going to print this just yet. The next group is the page size group. Now on the page size group we can choose the size for the report. Mine defaults to A4. If I wanted to change to a different size, for instance if I wanted to change to A5, what I would then find is that everything still sits on a single page. Note that in A5 you can see the bottom of that page, and that by default there is a date at the bottom. I'm going to go back to my A4 size. The default in Europe and the UK is generally A4. Default in the USA of course would normally be letter size. And then you can also set margins. Now again, by default you'll probably find that you have narrow margins set, which fits the maximum amount onto each page. But if I say wanted to change to wide margins, look at what this does to the report. I now get much wider margins. This can be useful either to help in layout, or perhaps if you're sending this report out for review, it may give people space to sort of jot notes or mark comments around the edges of the report page. The next group is the page layout group. Now in the page layout group you can choose between portrait orientation and landscape orientation. Note that in landscape orientation this does go to a second page, and then columns, if I want a multi-column layout I can specify the number of columns here. So if you're using the columnar layout, that is an important dialog. And what's happened there is that we have opened the page setup dialog with the columns tab selected automatically. Apart from the options there for individual column settings, there's also a page tab where you can choose things like orientation, paper size, etc., and you can choose your printer. And then you have print options. Again, this is another location where you can set your margins. The next option in the page layout group opens the page setup dialog, so it's another way into that same dialog. Now let's look at zoom. In the zoom group you have a zoom control, and if you click on the zoom drop down there you can see we're at the default 100% here. If you wanted to zoom in more, perhaps to get close to the detail, you could go for 150%, maybe even 500%. And if you're zoomed in so that you can't see all of the report, you use the scroll bars on the right or at the bottom to move around the report. Or you can zoom right out, so 25% would make that look like a very small page. Note that apart from the zoom control, you also have a zoom slider at the bottom right hand of the window. And the zoom slider currently indicates the 25% that we've already selected. Now there are a couple of ways that you can use the zoom control. You can use the plus button at the right end or the minus button at the left end to take you through different zoom settings, and they generally operate in 10% increments. Once you've got to a whole multiple of 10, they work in 10% increments. So that gives you a very straightforward way of going to a specific percent of zoom. Now apart from that zoom control, you also have in the zoom group the options of showing one page in view, 2 pages in view, or in fact, depending on your report, you may want more than 2 pages, 4, 8 or 12 pages in view. So they're the main options that I'm going to look at the moment on the print preview screen. And when you've finished using the print preview screen, you click on close print preview, and that will take you into the report design that we're going to look at in the next section. Note that when you are working on a report, if you look at the buttons at the right hand end of the status bar, you have a button to take you into design view, one for layout view, one for print preview, and one for report view where you see the report itself. If I want to go back into print preview, click that button and I'm back to where I was. That's the end of this section. Please join me in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In the preceding section we looked at a very straightforward report, and I showed you how to use the print preview tab to preview the report and to customize many of the settings associated with, for example, margins, paper size, orientation and so on. In this section we're going to look at report design. I'm going to stick with that very simple country report in this section, and then in the next section we'll create a more complex and detailed report. Now at the moment you can see the report that we created in the preceding section open in design view. And in this view at the moment, and bearing in mind that this is a very straightforward report, you can see a typical report structure. We have at the beginning a report header, and this appears right at the beginning of the report, and at the end a report footer, which obviously appears at the very end of the report. We then have on every page of the report potentially a page header and a page footer. And the central section of the report, the details section, is the section that is repeated for every record in the report. Now when I say a record, that isn't necessarily just a record from a table as it is in this case. It may be a record from a data set produced by a query, which in some cases can be quite a complex query. Now one of the first things to point out is that if I right click somewhere within the report, I get a contextual menu that lets me perform some quite important operations if I wish to do so. So for instance, if you look at these options towards the bottom of the contextual menu, there is an option there that says page header and footer. At the moment the little icon is highlighted, and that means that there is a page header and footer in this particular report. If I click that, I can switch the page header and footer off, but beware, because when I've done that, note, deleting these sections will also delete all the controls in them. So if you've set up a header and footer and then you say, no, I'm not sure about that, I'll look at it without, any work you've done is potentially going to be lost. Now I'm not going to do this at the moment because I don't want to lose that page header and footer. But if I go back to that menu for a moment, there's also an option to switch on and off having a report header and footer. And you can also do things like show or hide the properties sheet. Note again that at the bottom of the contextual menu the icon against properties is shown, which means that the properties sheet is shown. If I wanted to see the report properties, if I click on that, I'll see the properties for the whole report. When we're designing reports, many of the features of the work that we do are similar to the features of the work we do when we're designing forms. So you have controls have properties, you can do things like set the size, set the captions, etc. So many of the skills that you've already developed for designing forms you'll find very useful for designing reports. Note that there is a report design tools set of 4 tabs. Currently and by default the design tab is selected, and the tools on the design tab are pretty similar to the tools on the form design tools design tab. So let's start with the details section of this report. It's pretty straightforward. We have a single field, it is the country. And of course if I wanted to change the width, the height, the font, the alignment, I could do all of those using the properties sheet with country selected. For page header, the page header is a label, and the label says just the word country. Now note the name that has been assigned by Access 2016 is country_label. If I look at the list of all of the controls, you'll see that as when you are doing form design, many of the controls, including labels, get default names. And I normally go through and change those names to more meaningful names. You may find that a useful thing to do with reports as well. In fact, I'll do this in this particular case, and then that will explain a couple of things better a little later on as well. So having done that renaming, you can see how much easier it is to find your way around the report. And given that the report has 5 sections, which is pretty typical as the basis for a report, it's worth knowing what the names of the sections are. So for instance, the report header section is called report header, and if I select report header, I'm not talking about an individual control, I'm talking about the whole of that section. And within that section you have, for example, got this header label as well. Similarly, the report footer is a whole section within the report, although that section is currently empty. So back to the page header. As I said just now, we just have the country label in there that just says the word country. In the page footer though, we have 2 controls. One of the controls is a text box with an expression in it, and I've called that the page footer now text box. And the one on the right is the page footer page count text box. So we have two text boxes and each of those has an expression in it. Let's deal with the first one. If I select it, note the name, and note that the control source is not a field, it's an expression. If I click on the ellipsis against control source, it brings up the expression builder, and you can see there the expression that's used in this particular text box. And the expression uses the function now. Now, you'll soon get used to some of these functions. This is one of the built-in functions. It's a date and time function. It's now, and it's a function that returns a variant of type date, specifying the current system date and time. You may remember looking at date before, and date just returns the current system date. Now gives you the date and time. So once again, we've used an expression here to provide information which is not part of any record in any of our tables. Now let me cancel the expression builder and look at this other expression, because this is a considerably more complex expression. It's actually made up of 4 strings concatenated together. The concatenation symbol is the ampersand, so they're the 3 ampersands concatenating the 4 strings. And the literal strings are the ones which are contained in double quotes. So the first literal string is page, P-A-G-E, followed by a space. Now the second one is one of the access system variables, and page in square brackets denotes the current page number. The third string is another literal in double quotes, and it's space, OF of space. The fourth string is another access system variable, and this one is pages with an S on the end in square brackets, and this is the total number of pages in this report. So what we're actually showing in this text box is a statement which will say something like page 3 of 6, for example. Now there are quite a few typical common statements which access these access system variables, and if you click on common expressions you will see some of them. Now note that in the example here that's been built by Access itself, these values have been put in square brackets, whereas they're shown without square brackets here. I tend to always use the square brackets myself, and I think you'll find that Access usually does as well. So for instance, a common expression page number, you would put page space in double quotes, ampersand, and then page. That's access system variable. Total number of pages is typically just pages. Page n of m, that's the equivalent of the expression that we've just been looking at. The current date is date, note the round brackets. Current date time is now, note the round brackets. You'll probably find that you use those expressions quite a bit, particularly when you are creating reports in Access. Okay, let's take a look at how this report looks. So I'm going to go up to the View tab on this occasion. I'm going to look at Report View. It's a one-page report at the moment, and note the date at the bottom there, Tuesday, May the 10th, 2016, and page 1 of 1 at the right. Note that rather unhelpful heading. Let's go back into the report design again. Let me change a couple of aspects of this. Let's start with how the date appears. Now we know that we're showing a date in that field, but if you want to see the format of that date, it's held in the Format property in the property sheet. It's currently shown as long date. Let's try medium time, just to see what it looks like. And then within the header, I have this rather unhelpful label here. In fact, the header itself, you notice all the space under the label is below the label. There's very little above it. And if I want to center the text in the report, the best way to do it normally is to make, in this case, the label equal to the full width of the report, but then center the text within the label. So I go to Text Align next, and change it from general to center. And then the caption I'm going to change, currently says RPT countries, which is the name of the report. Let's change it to, I do think that's a more helpful label for the header. Now I'm going to put some text in the report footer. There doesn't appear to be anywhere to put it at the moment, but if you hover over the bottom of the bar until you get the horizontal line and the double-headed arrow, you can actually pull out a little bit of report footer paper to write on. Now I'm going to draw a text box in the report footer. I'll worry about positioning it accurately, etc. a little bit later on. And I'm going to enter an expression. Now the expression I'm going to enter, I'm going to click in the control source for that box. Instead of using the expression builder, I'm going to type it straight in. So there's my expression. I'm going to change the name of the text box. I'm going to change the alignment within it to center. I think I'll just reduce the height a little bit, and maybe I need slightly less vertical space in the report footer. Let's see how that looks now. Okay. Now there's still quite a lot to do on the appearance of the report. For example, the header has a shaded background, whereas the report footer is in a plain box with a border around it, and we have different size fonts in use and so on. So on the cosmetic side there would be quite a bit to do. But now it's time to move on to a more complex report, which we're going to do in the next section. I'll see you then. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to create a more complex report. Now when we talk about a more complex report, the complexity is more often than not due to a complex structure to the report, and that in turn is quite often because we have nested information within the report. Think of a form and a subform. Well, with reports you very often have the same situation. A report comprises information about a particular entity, and then you may well have a sub-report with repeated additional information about that entity. One way of creating that kind of structured report is to use very much the same approach that we use for forms, where we create a subform, and then we create a form and insert the subform into the form, and the subform contains repeated information about the entity represented on the form. So for example, we might have an actors subform on a movie form, and the actors subform contains a list of the actors and their roles within their movie. That's something that we've looked at already on the course. Now taking that one step further, and this can happen on forms and reports, you can have many levels of nesting of that information. So you could have, for example, subforms within forms, or subreports within subreports within reports, etc. One way of creating the report that I'm going to create in this section would be to create a subreport, create a report, and include the subreport into the report. And that's a very good approach, a very popular approach, one you might well want to try yourself. But the approach that I'm going to take here is a rather different approach. It may almost seem like cheating in a way, but it gives you a good result. It's relatively easy to understand, and it gives you a lot of control over the ultimate layout of your report. So what I'm going to do is to create a report for Esprit de Tour. It will list the visited countries, and then for each of the countries it will show the trips that go to that country, and then for each trip it will list the scheduled tours, the ones that are actually available to book. Now bear in mind the warning that I gave you earlier on in the course. If you're using the dates that you've imported from the delimited text files provided by me, these may well be dates well in the past by now, but that won't affect the building or usage of this report. So you may have updated those dates as I outlined earlier on in the course. You may have left them the same. Whichever way you're doing it, I still want you to go ahead and include all tours within each trip, even if the tour is by now in the past. So just to repeat myself, we're going to list the countries. For each country we're going to show the trips. For each trip we're going to show the tours. Bear in mind that Esprit de Tour do not currently have trips going to all countries in the country table. So at the highest level in this report, we're doing a report on countries. So I'm going to select the country table, and then I'm going to go to the Create tab and run the report wizard. So I want to show the country in the report, so I click there on the right arrow to add country to the report. But I also want information from other tables, and the first other table that I need information from is the trip table. So I choose the trip table here, and I have a list of the available fields. Now in the report I'm really going to include virtually everything here. I don't think I'll need the ID, that's the unique ID for a trip. The trip code I'll need because I use that to link through to tour records. But I don't need ID, everything else I do need. Now I could go through and one by one add these to the selected fields. Alternatively, if I use the double right arrow there, the double right chevron, I get all of the fields, and then all I need to do is to select the ID field and remove that from the selected fields, and I have all the fields that I need so far. So that's country and everything from trip records except the unique ID. The other table that I need information from is the tour table, so I'm going to select tour next. Now that's straightforward enough. I need everything from that table, so I'm going to use the double chevron, and that's a complete list of all the fields that I need, and I click on next. One of the key aspects of this report is that it is going to be grouped. The first grouping level is by country. So for each country there will be a section of the report, and within that section all of the trips for that country will appear. So my first grouping level is country. I make sure that's selected in the list there, and I click on the right chevron. So that's my first grouping level. Now within the country I'm going to group by trip code. In the trip records that field is called code. So code is going to be my next level. So they're the two levels for grouping within my report. The next step with the wizard is to look at the sort order. Now the sort order relates to the detail records, not the grouping, and within each trip the detail records are the tour records. So I'm going to arrange those by start date. That's start date ascending. Note that I have up to 4 fields available here to specify the sort order for the detail records. Let's take a quick look at these summary options while we're here, because we're going to use one of these. I want to highlight the lowest adult price for each trip. So I'm going to say the cheapest available tour for this trip for an adult price is this. So I'm looking for minimum price adult. So that's going to be the highlighted summary value. Okay, that's all my selections. Now I click on next. So now I can choose a layout for my report. As usual, there's a preview here, and the basic layout choices are stepped, and you can see in the preview there that we have our first grouping level in the first column, second grouping level in the second column, and then the detail records here are shown in a third and fourth column. The next alternative is block. You basically have the same layout, but instead of that sort of diagonal effect, everything is blocked across. So that's the first grouping level, second grouping level, and so on. That wouldn't really be very suitable in this case, because at the second grouping level, which is the trip level, there is a lot of information, including the trip description. So trying to fit it into a relatively narrow column would be pretty awkward. Let's look at the outline option. Now the outline option is like the stepped option, but you have these headings above the detail records. I think that's going to be the best option in this case. I'm also going to choose landscape layout. And there is a further option here, adjust the field width so that all fields fit on a page. I'm going to leave that checked, but in effect here I'm going to have to reorganize this report quite a bit anyway, because the information is quite variable. I've got everything from very small fields like prices up to very long description fields, so there'll probably be quite a bit of reorganizing to do here anyway. But I'm going to keep that checked, and I can put right anything that doesn't come out correctly from the report wizard. So click on next. So first of all, let me rename the report, and I'm sure I'm going to need to modify the report's design, but let's preview the report first. So we preview the report selected there, click on finish, and Access will make our report. Now the main issue here is that although Access has produced a report, it's got several things, if you like, in the wrong place. Let me just explain the structure here. We have our first grouping level, country, Costa Rica, in this case is the first item. Then we have our second grouping level, which is the trip level, and we've got code CRM. Then we have our multi-column detail records. And the problem with the detail records here is that the detail doesn't relate to a tour. It's actually the detail related to a trip. So for instance, we have trip name Costa Rica multi-activity repeated for each tour, which is of course technically true, but we really ought to have the trip name up here at the trip grouping level. So we should have something like code CRM, and then the trip name should be up here and not repeated in the detail records as it is. Similarly, the activity level, the number of days, the description, these all relate to the trip, not to the tour. So what I need to do is to change the design so that those aspects are actually included at the trip level, not the tour level. Now that's pretty easy to do. All I need to do is to go into design view, and we'll take a look at the design of this report. On this occasion I'm going to use the button down at the right hand end of the status bar that lets us go into design view for the report. So let's look at the overall structure of the report first. We have a report header at the beginning and a report footer at the end. We then have a page header and towards the end there, page footer. These are repeated on each page of the report. At the moment, as you can see, the page header is empty, and the page footer contains now, which of course is current date and time, and on the right it has page and then the page number of and then the total number of pages. Then we have a country header. So this is our first level of grouping. We have a country header which contains the label country and the name of the current country, and then we have a country footer which gives a summary in terms of the count of the number of records, but it also has a minimum, and this would actually be the minimum adult price for the country. So I don't particularly see the need for a minimum tour price for a country, particularly given the range of trips and prices for each country. So I'm going to remove this summary information here. It's simple to do. Select the fields, delete, and then you can also close up the space if you don't want the additional space at the end of a country. I am, however, going to leave summary information at the code level, that is the trip level. So I'm not going to do that summary, I'm going to take that out, but the minimum price for a tour on a particular trip I am going to leave there. I'm going to change the label, I'm going to realign things a little bit, as you'll see in a moment. But the main issue I have here is that in the details section I have a load of information that relates to the trip and therefore to all the tours for that trip, and what I really need to do is to move that information into the trip level. So I'm going to put it into the code header. Now if you look at the code header, currently the only specific field for a trip there is the code, but there's a whole row of headings, and these are the headings for the detail records. So it's important that I leave them in position. I'm actually going to make the code header bigger, and I'm going to select all of these heading labels, just move them down to the bottom of the code header section out of the way for the moment. And then I'm going to choose the fields in the detail record which should actually be in the code header section. So for instance, the description, that shouldn't be there, that should be up here in the code header section, and I need to make that into a nice big field. The trip name, that should also be up here, but the code field definitely doesn't need to be as wide as that. So I'm going to carry on reorganizing the code header and the details section, including closing up these labels, which are going to be the headers for the details section. Join me in a moment when I've done that. So I've done some more work on the design of the report. I'm going to do a little bit more, but I'm pretty happy with where I've got to so far. I'll show you that in just a moment, but I'd like to point out a couple of things in the design that you may find useful. You notice there that I have the description field selected in the code header, and there's a particular property towards the bottom of the property sheet there, can grow, that is set to yes. In a situation like this one, where you have a description which might be quite short, maybe just a few words, one sentence, or perhaps could be quite a long paragraph or two, it's difficult to know how much space to allow in a report layout. Well, if you set the value of can grow to yes, but set the height of the field in the report, as I have done here, to just 1 row in height, what Access 2016 will do is to adjust the height of that field each time it's used, just to accommodate the amount of text in the description for that particular trip. Note also that there is also a can shrink property there, and I'll leave you to work out how you could use can shrink in a different but related situation. Now don't forget, you have quite a lot of tools you can use to help you doing this sort of layout. You've got grid and rulers, you've got the alignment tools. Notice that I've changed the header label text and I've changed the font styles in places. You'll see in a moment that the lowest price I've sort of highlighted as a bit of a special offer, and I also point out to you here that that field is not a label. It'll look like a label when you look at the report, but it's actually done as a text box so that the contents of the text box pretending to be a label can be variable. So let's just do a bit of a preview. Let's look at the report in report view. Notice this, our lowest adult price for CRM there, and the next one, our lowest adult price for CFA. See what I mean about what appears to be a label, the content's actually changing? Well, you can see how I've done that. And notice how now the trip information is all at the same level above the list of tour instances. So look for some of the things that I've done in there in this report layout. If I go not into report view but into print preview, I'll see how many pages are involved in this actual report, and of course if I wanted to print them out I could. There's only one country with more than one trip at the moment, and that's the USA. So that's it for this section. Please join me in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's time now for exercise 8, and exercise 8 is a little bit trickier than some of the earlier exercises. I need you to create a report, and although the general approach on the report is going to be similar to the one that I've used in the preceding section to create a structured report for the Esprit de Tour company, this structured report is for the Night Movies database. You probably have a different amount of data recorded to me, so I've just got a version of my answer to exercise 8 here with 4 movies in it. Make sure you have at least, say, 4, 5, 6 movies, hopefully more than that with several pages if possible. But I only want you to include the movies which have actors and their roles recorded. And for each movie and for each actor and role, rather than presenting the information in the conventional way, what I'd like you to do is to respect the structure of movie and actor, but to present the data in sentence form like this. So looking at the first bold line there, The Shawshank Redemption was directed by Frank Darabont, released in 1994 and runs for 142 minutes. Now, getting that sentence to look quite as neat as that, you need to do it in a particular way that I hope you can figure out. Once you've figured it out, you'll have no problem producing the lines that list the roles for the players. So Morgan Freeman, who was born in USA on June 1st, 1937, played Ellis Red Redding, Tim Robbins, etc. It's a different way of presenting the data. It's a bit of a challenge. And as an additional and hopefully much simpler challenge, I'd like you to use a theme in the report that you haven't used before. I've used a different theme here, and with that goes a word of warning. It's always a good idea to choose the theme for a report as early on as you can. Same goes for choosing a theme for forms, because if you don't make the choice early on, what might happen is you do a lot of the sizing, alignment, etc. on your report or your form, and then when you change the theme later on, either the font gets bigger and nothing fits, you have to move it all around again, or maybe the font gets smaller, you've got spaces all over the place that you don't really want, and again you have to go and realign everything. So choose that different font earlier on and make sure that you do it before you try to finalize any layout in this report. My answer is in the usual place, exercise 8. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to take a look at printing. I've mentioned printing once or twice already. We saw a print dialog, we've looked at one or two print preview screens. I want to tell you a few other things about options for printing. And just before I do that, I'm going to talk about something that I haven't pointed out before, but it's a feature of Access 2016 that can be very useful when it comes to documenting a database that you're designing and building. And I'll use this feature as a basis for some preliminary discussions on printing. On the Database Tools tab, one of the options is Database Documenter. And the Access 2016 Documenter is a really useful way of documenting not the data in your database, but the design of your database. Now, when you open the Documenter, you have a number of tabs, and these tabs give you access to the main objects within your database. So the Tables tab gives you access to the various tables, Queries tab, Forms tab, Reports tab, etc. Let's go back to the Tables tab and let's select the trip table. Now if I select the trip table and click on OK, what I see is a definition of the design of the trip table. Now it might be quite difficult for you to read this, so let me just zoom in. Note if I hover with the cursor over the page, I have the magnifier with the plus, indicates a zoom in, it's changed to a minus, next click will be zoom out. And you can see that at the top of this definition I have properties. This is the properties of the trip table itself. And then I have the individual columns, information about the individual columns. So I start off with the ID column, then the code column, and so on. And I have a very full set of information about each column. And just to repeat, we're not looking at any data in the table here, we're only looking at the table definition. Now down at the bottom on the left, I have some navigation buttons to take me through this definition, and as you can see it's a pretty full document. And once I get through the definitions of the individual columns or fields, I then have details of the relationships between the trip table and various other tables in my database. So I have a very full definition here. Let me just close this preview down for a moment. Let me choose the trip table this time, and now when I click on Database Documenter, it goes straight into the tables. There's the trip table. The options button at the bottom here lets me choose what I see in the definition. It has defaulted here to pretty much everything that's available, so all of these are checked, and I've got the bottom option here where there are some option selections. And basically the definition of the trip table that we were looking at just now is the everything definition. And given that, when I go into that definition, if I wanted to print it out, I could first of all use the Print Preview tab to do things like set the size, the margins, portrait or landscape, number of columns, and so on. And when I click on Print to print it, as before, I have a number of options for printing. It's defaulted here to Microsoft Print to PDF, but I could print to fax, I could print to a physical printer, I can print to a Microsoft XPS document, or I can send it to OneNote. Let's suppose I was going to send this to OneNote. Once I've made that selection, I then have properties on the right, and I get a choice of properties that are appropriate to my selection. Now when it comes to printing to OneNote, I really don't get many options at all. I get a choice of orientation, portrait or landscape. If I click on Advanced, I get options related to paper size, where I could change from, let us say, to A4, the number of copies that I want, and the graphic resolution. So not a huge number of choices when it comes to printing to OneNote. If I, on the other hand, want to print to my physical printer, which in my case is an HP PSC 2500 series printer, it's quite an old printer, but it's got a good set of features. Here I can choose again paper size. I think I'll go back to A4. And then I have other selections such as color settings, but then I can do things like finishing settings, where I can do things like select whether to print on both sides. Now in the case of my printer it doesn't do printing on both sides, but I can say print on both sides manually. If I check that option, then it will let me print all of the odd numbered pages. Then I can physically turn the paper pages over, feed them back into the printer, and it will print on the other sides. Effects, so I can do things like scale to a percentage of normal size. I can also do things like add watermarks. I can choose paper quality, and then in the advanced settings I have other settings related to things like the page order. The layout option here is front to back. I might do back to front. Now exactly the options you get will depend on your printer and the features that it supports. If on the other hand I wanted to print to PDF, Microsoft Print to PDF, that's what I'm going to do on this occasion. Click on the properties. Again, I get portrait or landscape, and then the advanced properties I get paper size and how many copies I want. Now on this occasion I'm going to print to PDF just to take a look at the printed document. I'm going to print to PDF into the course file folder. Now the name that I've given this PDF file is doubletriptabledefinition.pdf. And now if you want to see a copy of that table definition, you'll find it in the course file folder. So I've introduced you to the database documenter, and we've looked at some of the main features of printing. There are a couple of other important things to know about. Let me close the print preview of this table definition, and let's return to the question of regular printing. Say we wanted to print the entries in the country table. If I select the country table, one of the options that I have on my quick access toolbar is print preview, and if I click on print preview, there is a print preview of the contents of the country table. Of course in this case I'm looking at the data. The ability to do a print preview, or indeed a quick print, may well be something you want to make sure is always there on the quick access toolbar. At the moment, as you can see, my print preview is checked and enabled. My quick print isn't. Also, let me just close that print preview. If you go into Backstage View, there is a print option, and the print option basically gives you three options. There's a quick print option that sends the object that's currently selected directly to the default printer without making changes. So if I click that now, it will just send the country print that you've seen just now directly to my default printer, whatever my default printer is. If I click on print, what happens is it brings up the straightforward print dialog, so I can choose my printer, I can set things like number of copies, number of pages, etc. And if from Backstage View Print I choose the third option, Print Preview, it takes the currently selected object, opens it in Print Preview, and then I can do all the normal print preview things with that object. So for a table, you've seen there the use of the two options on the Quick Access toolbar and three options from Backstage View. Let me close that. If I say selected one of the forms, what about the trip maintenance form? Go into Backstage View, go to Print, click on Print Preview. What it's showing me now is a print preview of the trip maintenance form with data in place, and of course I can step through the pages of that and see what it would look like if I printed it. That's printing. I'll see you in the next section. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. Much earlier on in the course we looked at the available data types for Access desktop databases, and we've been using most of those data types throughout the course, but there are still a few that we haven't looked at all yet, and in this section I'm going to explain 2 or 3 of them to you and demonstrate a couple of them as well. And we're going to start to use 1 or 2 of those in the Esprit de Tour database. Now don't forget this help topic in Access, which does explain all of these data types. The first one that we're going to look at in this section is the yes/no data type. And this is a data type that's used normally to denote a true or false condition. And the way that we're going to use this in the Esprit de Tour database is that instead of using a 0 value in a child price to denote that a tour is adults only, we're going to introduce a yes/no field, and a yes/no value of yes or true in that field will indicate that this is an adults only trip. Now when we're adding a field to an existing table, you can just add new fields to the end of the table. Basically the sequence of the fields in a table is not significant, in that you can always access the fields in a table in whatever sequence you like, and you don't even necessarily know what sequence they are physically stored in on a storage device. So if you have a preference to place a new field in a particular place, it's entirely up to you. One of the options, if I say wanted to put it in front of price minimum, just because for some reason it looked neater, if you select the row in the table and click on Insert Rows, it just opens up a space for you. I'm going to call this Adults Only. Data type yes/no. And the default value here is no. Now when I add a new field, one of the things I clearly need to do is to make sure that any existing data is set up with the appropriate yes or no value. So what I'm going to do on this occasion is to just go into Datasheet View, I'm going to go through the existing trips and just tick the ones that are adults only. There are just 3. That's the Iconic Italy trip, the SSL trip, and the WUC trip. Now, a couple of things to bear in mind here. One of them is that if I have created forms, I've implemented any aspect of my database which relies on identifying adults only on the basis of a 0 child price in a tour record, then I'm going to need to go through and change the way that that is set up, the way that the identification of adults only tours is done. So I may need to go through the existing database just to update anything that's already there in line with my new definition of an adults only yes/no field. And in order to do that, I may also need to change queries, for example, to make sure that adults only is one of the fields that's in the select list for any queries that are using this information. And an example of the sort of change you're going to need to make is that we now have a new field in the trip table, so we're going to need to make sure that that can be maintained on the trip maintenance form. So what I'm going to do here is to check the record source for the trip maintenance form. Well, it's the trip table, which means all of the fields in the trip table, so I don't need to worry about changing a select statement, but I am going to need to put a control on this form so that users can manage the adults only information. Now if I look at the controls in the gallery on the design tab in the form design tools, one of the controls there is this one, which is a checkbox. And I'm going to put a checkbox control on the form. It gets a default name and it has no control source, so it's currently unbound. What I'm going to do is to bind it to adults only. And I'm going to change its name checkbox. And then I'm going to find its label. I've renamed that to adults only checkbox label, and the caption is going to be. Now on this occasion I want to move the checkbox over to the right a little, and I'm going to separate out the caption. Okay, let's just check that out. Go into form view. So Grand Canyon Rafting Adventure. There we are. Iconic Italy is adults only, etc. So that works fine. And another point to bear in mind here is that if you're validating user input for people setting up tours and trips, amending details of tours and trips, that if a particular trip is adults only, then you would want to check, for example, that there are no child prices specified when people enter or amend the tour information about individual tours for that trip. Correspondingly, you would also want to say that if it isn't adults only, you probably want to make sure that there are child prices specified. The next data type I'd like to look at is the attachment data type. Now let's suppose that the Esprit de Tour company makes a full trip dossier for each trip that they offer, and that the dossier is presented as a PDF file that people can either print out themselves, I've emailed to them, maybe if they go into a local branch of Esprit de Tour, they have printed copies of the PDFs there. So I'm going to go back into the trip table in design view again, and I'm going to add a new field again. This is going to be dossier. The data type is attachment, and this is not a required field, although the intention is that every trip has a dossier. In the early stages of a trip being offered, the dossier may not really be ready for people to use. So having added that, I'm now going to go into the datasheet view for the trips. Dossier column is over there on the right. And the very first trip, the GCA trip, I've actually prepared a dossier for. Note the paperclip with 0 for 0 attachments. Let's double click in that one. Now I can actually have a number of attachments. At this stage we only plan to have a single dossier for each trip, but that gives me expansion possibilities. Maybe I could publish information about flights from the client's locale. So click on Add. There's the one that I'm looking for. Click on OK. So I've attached the dossier to the details of that trip. I'm going to close the trip table. Once again I'm going to go back into trip maintenance and put in a provision for a user to access that dossier. So once again I look at the controls in the form design tools on the design tab. The control that I want in this particular case is that one. That's the attachment control. So I'm going to draw a suitable control there. Currently of course it's unbound. I'm going to change the name of that control to dossier, and the control source is dossier. Now for format just going to check the border style. I don't want a border around this, so make that transparent. And then for the label of dossier, and I'm going to call it dossier label, and I'm just going to right align the contents, and I'm going to squeeze it over there a little. I think I'll move the dossier. In fact, the dossier probably doesn't have to be quite that wide. I'll move that over there and move that away there a little bit. Let me align everything on the top row. That's it. Now I'm just going to align top. That's fine. Now let's take a look. And what you can see there now, for this particular trip, there is a dossier. So you see the little PDF symbol there. Now I should warn you that with this particular dossier, all I've done is taken the trip description and put it into a PDF file. I haven't actually prepared a full dossier, but of course the travel company would do that. Let's double click on that to see what we get. List of attachments. One of the attachments is our PDF. Select it, click on open, and there would be the full dossier for this trip. When I finish reading the full dossier, click on close, and I'm back to my trip maintenance form again. So in this section I've demonstrated a couple of other data types. There are really three others that you need to be aware of. One of them is the OLE object data type. This is a rather specialized data type and is usually used for things like attaching something like an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document to a record, where you need an element of interaction with that spreadsheet or document. And generally speaking, if all you want to do is to be able to access something like a document, in much the same way that we just access the dossier, you'd be better off using the attachment data type because it's more flexible. But there can be situations where you do need the level of interaction that you get with the OLE object data type, but I'm not going to go into that further here. Hyperlink is another data type, and this would include a link address to a document or file on the internet, on an intranet, on a local area network, a LAN, or on your local computer. In the Esprit de Tour database, we might create a field linking to the perhaps tourism site for one of the countries visited, or perhaps linking to information about one of the day trips, or perhaps to one of the places of special interest that is visited on the trip. And another type here, the calculated type, and in a calculated data type field you can store the result of an expression. So for instance, you could calculate a family price based on adult prices and child prices for trips where they are not adults only. Or perhaps if somebody was placing an order for a movie rental, you could calculate the total cost of the order, including, for example, delivery and any discounts that might apply. So those three other types pretty much complete our list of data type options. Don't forget the Access 2016 help if you decide to give them a try. But that's it on data types for now. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. So far on the course we've spent quite a bit of time looking at the design of forms, and we've introduced and added quite a few different types of control on forms. There are many more types to deal with, and I'm going to look at one or two more of them in this section. Now if I go into trip maintenance, I'm going to go into design view. You've seen this gallery a few times and we've dealt with a number of these controls. So for instance, the first control there is the text box, then we have the label. The next control is a button. I'm going to talk about buttons a little bit later on. But then we have some controls that we're not going to cover on the course, but let me briefly explain one or two of them to you. We have a tab control, and it's possible to set up forms in Access 2016 where you have a form with a number of tabs on it. Now in the case of trip maintenance, for example, if you had so much information about a trip to maintain that it wouldn't all fit visibly on the screen at once, you might have tabs across the top of the screen to let you tab through the various groups of properties of the trip. The next control along is the hyperlink control, and this is useful for giving you quick access to, for example, web pages, websites, and in some cases files perhaps on your local system. The next control is a web browser control, and I think the name there tells you what that does. Again, we're not going to cover that in this course, but that's another interesting and useful one to experiment with, particularly if in your application you're linking to other web sources. We then have a navigation control. I'm going to talk a little bit about navigation in 2 or 3 sections from now. And then we have one of the other controls that I am going to look at now, and that is the option group. And what we're going to do for each of our trips is we're going to indicate the level of accommodation for the trip. Now, we don't deal with anything less than 3-star accommodation, but a trip will either say has 3-star, 4-star or 5-star accommodation. And I'm going to introduce an option group whereby we can maintain and in fact display the level of accommodation on any of our trips. So the first thing we need to do is to add a new field to our trip table. Now, Esprit de Tour really only deal with accommodation level 3-star, 4-star and 5-star. But one of the things that you can do, particularly if you plan to use an option group as the interface between the database and the user, is that you don't actually have to store, for example, 3-star or 4-star or 5-star somewhere. What you can do instead is to map and say, my values for accommodation level are going to be 1, 2 and 3. 1 is 3-star, 2 is 4-star, 3 is 5-star. So I'm going to introduce a new field. I'm going to put it at the end. Now it's only going to be a very small number, so I'm going to say that it's numeric. There's my little code, translation code for it. I'm going to say that the data type I need, because it's such a small range of numbers, is byte, and the default value will be 1. Is it a required field? Yes, it is. Is it indexed? Yes, it is. Are duplicates okay? Of course they are. Now, users are only going to be able to access this via an option group, so in theory we should never need to validate this data, because it should be impossible for a user to add anything other than a 1, 2 or 3 to the field value here. Some people, including me, would normally put in a validation rule anyway. In other words, we would put in a rule that says it must be 1, 2 or 3. On the basis that somebody may, for instance, write a faulty query and accidentally try to put a value other than 1, 2 and 3 into this field on a record in the trip table. So normally I would put in a validation rule anyway, but just to save a little bit of time now, I'm going to leave it out, and I'm just going to leave this as it is. It looks as though people would be free to put in any number they like, but we're going to cover that in the form. So there's the change to my trip table. Of course, existing data will be invalid because there are no values in there. So I'm going to have to go through that routine where I save the table and I force it to accept the fact that none of the existing trips have a value in there. And then I will manually put in those values to make the data valid again. Okay, I've entered that data. I'm going to open up the trip maintenance form in design view again. Just going to decide where to put this accommodation level information. I think what I'm going to do is to just make a little bit of space to the right of the duration. Okay, I think I may have enough space there. What I'm now going to do is to add an option group. And that's the option group control in the gallery. So click on that to select, then draw an option group. The option group will contain a set of option buttons, and each of those option buttons will correspond to one of the 3 options that are available, in this case for accommodation level. Now, the default name for this option group is frame 46. I'm going to rename that to, and then the control source will be accommodation level. Now, as you can see, it has a label. I'm going to rename that, and I'm also going to change the caption. Let me just stretch the label out. Okay, now what I need to do is to put my option buttons in there for the 3 available options. In the Form Design Tools Design Controls gallery, the option button is that one. So I select it and I put in my first option button. Now, having added the first option button, it automatically gets the option value 1. That's the default as you add option buttons to a group. When I add the second one, it will automatically get the value 2, and so on. And so I've got one more option button to add, and that gets the value 3. Now at the moment, of course, users wouldn't have any idea what those words meant, so I need to change option 48 to say 3-star, option 50 to say 4-star, option 54 to say 5-star, and then I need to do a little bit of alignment to make it all look a little bit neater. So join me again in just a moment. So I've tidied up the accommodation level option group quite a bit. As usual, I wouldn't quite finish it off and make it 100% accurate until I'm sure that everything else is in place. But we're certainly in a position now that we can take this form for a test drive. So we go to Form View, and you can see the very first trip, Grand Canyon Family Rafting Adventure, is coming up as 4-star. And then as I step through, you can work out where I've put the 1s, the 2s and the 3s on our trips. So that's how to set up and use an option group on a form. So option group we've just looked at. We then have insert page break, start the next page at the current position when the form is printed. Now, of course, we've already got 1 or 2 combo boxes in use. I'll come back to them in just a moment. We have a chart control. You can draw straight lines. This is quite often useful in terms of separating out categories of information. Toggle button is a good alternative to a checkbox. Then we have list box. Now, list box is really an alternative to combo box. The combo box tends to take up less space, and combo box can be particularly useful when you allow people to enter values that are not part of the list contained within the combo box. So this is when you are not limiting people to list, although of course you can limit them to list with a combo box. If we take the activity level combo box here as an example, if I right click on that, one of the change to options is list box. And if I then go into form view for that, you can see the difference there in terms of how a list box looks compared to a combo box in that situation. Now I can adjust the height of the list box as displayed on the form. So let me just go back into design view, and I'm going to reduce the height to pretty much the height of a text box or the combo box when the selection is shown. Let's now go back into form view, and with a list box you don't get a drop down as you do with a combo box when you've set the height like that. You get the little roller controls on the right, the little roller buttons, and you can roll through the available options to choose the one that you want. So you can reduce the space that's occupied by the list box, but you don't have the advantage of the automatic drop down list that you get with the combo box. Now let me go back into design view and undo those changes. And then after list box we have rectangle, which like the line is often quite a useful way of grouping or categorizing controls. Checkbox we've already looked at. Unbound object frame. This lets you put a frame in place. For instance, you may want to put part of an Excel spreadsheet into a form page. Well, unbound object frame means you haven't yet bound it to the object, in this case the Excel spreadsheet. Over further 3 or 4 to the right we have the bound object frame. Attachment you've seen earlier on, radio button you've seen earlier on, option button that is, subform or subreport, and then finally you may want to put an image onto a form. You can of course use an image as a background to a form, for example. So that's a quick review of the remaining form controls. I suggest you experiment with some of these. With some of the others, their need will become apparent when you need the sort of data that they're intending to give you access to. But that's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section, I'm going to continue looking at form design, but I'm going to concentrate here on the actual stylistic side of design. Now, if I really wanted to go into this in a lot of detail, it would take a very long time. So I'm going to concentrate on the fundamental principles of the appearance of forms, and in particular, I'm going to look at themes. Now, within the components of Microsoft Office nowadays, you can achieve a pretty consistent approach to style by using themes. And the set of themes that are available in Access 2016 is compatible with the themes that are available in other parts of the Microsoft Office product set. So in particular, if you're preparing documents to go with your database, or indeed a database to go with other documents, you may want to be consistent about the theme that is used. When you create a new database, a default theme will be applied. In fact, this particular database has a custom theme of mine applied to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is to apply one of the standard themes to this database, and then I will explain to you how themes work in relation to an Access database. In the Form Design Tools on the Design tab, there is a Themes group, and if I click on the drop down for themes, you see a gallery of themes. Now, the one that's actually in use here is a customization of the standard Office theme. I also have my own custom theme. Note that when I hovered over there, you could preview the effect of applying my theme to this particular form. Now, below that, we have the standard Microsoft Office theme. So we have Office, we have Facet, and so on. Now, what I'm going to do on this occasion is just browse through and choose the theme that I want to use. And note, as I'm hovering over these, the point that I warned you about before. Note how with the larger fonts that some of the themes use, the text in the controls, and particular text in some labels, is now flowing way outside the space available for those labels. So I've got to be very cautious here that I don't give myself a whole lot of redesign work to do. Now, it will need a little bit of work, but I'm going to go for the Facet theme. So if I right click on Facet, one of the options is make this theme the database default. And that's now what I've done. Now, that doesn't affect too many of the fields on this form. I just need to make that one a little wider. Now, the theme carries with it, in effect, a whole set of standard colors and standard fonts as well. And in the process of changing my theme, not only have I changed that set of standard colors, but I've changed the fonts as well. So before, the font that was generally in use was Calibri. The font that's now in use, if you for instance look at the label on trip name, the field whose width I just adjusted, is Trebuchet MS. And in fact, if you click in various fields, let's try that one, note again that the Trebuchet font is the one that is in use. If I look at a particular part of the form here, let's look at the form header section. By the way, to select a specific section, if you go to the Format tab, there's a little drop down at the left hand end of the ribbon, and you can choose any control, any label, any section of the form. And what I'm going to do here is select Form Header. And with Form Header selected, there is a background color, and the background color that is used is Text 2 Lighter 80%. Now, Text 2 is one of the standard colors, and Text 2 in this theme will be different from Text 2 in a different theme. Let's look at those standard colors. So I'm going to go back to the Design tab, and given that Facet is the theme that is currently selected, click on Colors, click on Customize Colors, And there you have the standard colours for the current theme. There's a set of a dozen coloured, and the little sample on the right previews each of those. So for instance, you have text dark 1, text light 1, text dark 2, text light 2, that's the same as the background colour, and they're previewed in the two panels to the right of the theme colours. Now each of the other colours is represented in that little histogram in each case. So starting with the blocks at the left, you have accent 1, accent 2, accent 3 and so on. If I wanted to change the theme colours, then I could make that change here, and I could save my own colour scheme to go with my own theme, because in changing the theme colours and moving away from the standard theme colours, I'd be one step towards creating my own theme, which may be very close to Facet, but which may use a different set of colours for one or more of these standard theme colours. Similarly with Facet, if I now go to fonts in the themes group, if I wanted to choose a different font to go with this particular theme, I could choose an alternative font as my own custom font. So customize fonts at the bottom here. You notice that the heading font is currently Trebuchet MS, the body font is Trebuchet MS as well. If I wanted to use a different font for either of those, I could select it from what's available and make that my custom font. And again, I'd be one step towards creating a custom theme. So basically you might select a theme to use and stick totally with that theme, or you can customize the theme by customizing the colors, customizing the fonts, pretty much any combination you like. Now with the Esprit de Tour database, I'm going to stick completely with the standard Facet fonts, and now I'm going to explain how the theme is used in various places, particularly on this form. So let's look again at the form header section. The background color is text 2 lighter 80%. If I click in background color in the properties sheet and click on the ellipsis, I bring up the color picker, and with the color picker I have two main sections. I have a theme colors section and a standard colors section. In the theme colors section, notice that the currently applied theme color is highlighted, it's that one, and it's text 2 lighter 80%. It's described as blue-grey. If I go down to the next color, that's text 2 lighter 60%. And as you will see, I can use any of the theme colors, and one very important point about using the theme colors is that if I use a theme color, if I change the theme, the color of the object that I've given a theme color to will change accordingly. However, if I gave this background a non-theme color, a standard color, let's suppose that I gave it, say, that yellow color. If I change the theme, let's suppose that I change from Facet to Ion, whereas fonts will change, other colors will change, etc. That one, which is set as a standard color, will not vary. The theme, the font, etc., everything else will change, but not that background color. So in sticking to theme colors, then I will get a high level of consistency if I decide to change theme. Now I'm going to put that back to being a theme color. Notice the theme colors here. We have background 1, text 1, background 2, text 2, and then we have those 6 other colors. The last two in the 12, are the ones that are used for hyperlinks. But supposing I decide to stick here with text 2 lighter 80%. And let's suppose also that I now select the detail section. The background color for that is actually background 1. Let me make that text 2 lighter 80% as well. And then finally I'll do the same with the footer. Now let's see what impact that has when I open the form. Actually look at it in form view. Now you see it gives the form quite a different appearance. I tend to go for sort of subtle, more pastel shades myself, and I think that does look quite a bit more attractive than it did before, and also it's easier to pick out the data because of the contrast between the background and the fields. Let's go back into design view one more time. Let's look at individual fields. Let's take the trip name field there. Now let me select the Format tab. The background color of that field is background 1. And again, background color from that, I can choose from the theme colors or the standard colors if I want something that's fixed. So generally speaking, you can go through, apply the same principle to each of the individual controls on the form. If you take something like the text in the labels, so let's take something like the trip name label there. The important color there is the foreground color because that's the color of the text, and it's currently text 1 lighter 50%. If again choose a theme color, let's suppose I wanted to use a really light color there. What about using background 1? Now background 1 is actually white. And sometimes using white for a label will work well as well, but it's very much a personal preference. As you make the background darker, having lighter colors for label text is a good idea. And again, you have that fundamental choice: do I go for a theme color or do I go for a non-theme color? So I just have a couple of other items to quickly mention here. One of them is that if I take one or more controls, let's suppose I select the description control there and click on the Format tab, I have a shape outline option in the control formatting group on the Format tab. And once again, I can choose a theme color or a standard color for the shape outline, which is effectively the border around that control. So if you look over here at the property sheet for that particular control, notice the background style normal, background color background 1, border style solid, border width hairline, border color is background 1 darker 35%. Let's go into shape outline. I could choose a very different color for the border. That's accent 5 lighter 40%. Note the change in the property sheet, and again I'm going to change the line thickness to very thick, and I'm going to change the line type to a dotted line. How's that? Now let's see how that looks. Pretty horrible, I would think, but as you can see, there are many possibilities. And finally, go back into design view just one more time. I mentioned colors already, and I mentioned the idea of creating custom colors. There are a standard set of colors that you can apply to the current theme. So if, for example, if you wanted to apply the red-orange color set, it would give the form, in this case, an overall red-orange effect. And if you then go into customize colors, if you look at all those accent colors, accent 1 up to accent 6, you see they all have a general sort of red to red brown kind of hue to them. So if you want an overall effect within a theme, which is basically a set of changes to the accent colors, then that's another good starting point. And again, you can customize that in the way that I mentioned before. And perhaps just one other thing to mention, of course, the same applies when it comes to styling reports. You can apply all of the same principles to the styling of reports. I'll leave you to experiment with that. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again, and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. We're starting to get a more comprehensive database now for Esprit de Tour, and we've put in place some maintenance functionality that will certainly get the company started on setting up their trips. At this stage we have a single ActDB file, and for somebody to maintain this trip information they would need to open the ActDB file and use the forms, queries, tables, etc. that we provided in order to do the maintenance of the information that is currently defined and maintained within this ActDB file. Now, so far there are really two types of information. There is the country information, sort of reference data if you like, a list of countries that we either have trips visiting at the moment or where we intend to run trips. And we have information about the trips themselves. Now, the maintenance of these two chunks of information can be done using just two forms, the country maintenance form and the trip maintenance form. There are of course a couple of reports that we can run as well, but basically if we gave somebody access to just those two forms, they could maintain the information without having direct access to the tables and queries that are also an essential part of our Esprit de Tour database. And in fact, giving somebody the ActDB as it is, with the navigation pane there on the left, would be an extremely dangerous thing to do, because somebody who didn't know what they were doing, or who perhaps was just a little bit inquisitive or careless, could open one of those tables, for example, change a definition of a field, delete some data, maybe change a query and not realize they changed it. They could do all sorts of damage to the database. So one very important thing to start to think about and work on, even at this relatively early stage in what might ultimately be a very large and complex database, is how we are going to present this to users. What will users see? At the moment, we'd be talking about a single user opening the ActDB file. But when your use of Access moves a little bit further forward, you'll find that you're looking at how to give many people access to the same data. Now, virtually everything you've learned about Access so far would still be relevant, but one of the things that you would need to do before too long is to separate out the data from the forms, etc., so that different people could access the same data. But that's a step farther than we're going here. For the moment, I want a very straightforward way of letting somebody use this ActDB file, but without giving them access to all of the objects that are the underlying infrastructure of the Esprit de Tour database. Now, the way we're going to do that is to develop what's called a navigation form. So we go to the Create tab, and one of the options in the form group is a navigation form. Now, there are actually 6 types of navigation form, and we're going to just use the top one, the first one, horizontal tabs. But when you found out how to create a navigation form, you might want to just take a look at the others, because some of the others may well suit your purposes either in this situation or in another one. But let's go for horizontal tabs. Now, the principle here is that in our navigation form, we give users access to the forms that they need to use, and in this case, with the horizontal tabs version, they access the different forms not by using the navigation pane on the left, but by clicking on the tabs of the navigation form. Now, as I mentioned, we've really got 2 forms that we need to give users access to. So I'm going to click in Add New here and type in a name for the first form. Now, when I've entered the name for the first form, I'm going to press the tab key, and I get a second tab, and this one is country maintenance. Press tab again. I only need 2. I'll come back to that Add New, the leftover one there, a little bit later on. Just don't worry about it for the moment. Now let me go back to the Trip Maintenance tab and click it to select it and bring up the Properties sheet. Now, first of all, I really need that tab to be a little bit wider. I can't get the whole of Trip Maintenance on it. So let's try making it just 50% wider, see if that's enough. Yep, that's fine. And now what I need to do is to define what's called the navigation target. So when I click on that tab, which of the objects in the database do we navigate to? So click on the drop down What we want to appear is the trip maintenance form. Now, in order to keep to some sort of reasonable standard, I'm going to change the name of the control here. Trip maintenance navigation button. And now when somebody's using the navigation form, if they click on the trip maintenance tab, they'll see the trip maintenance form. Now let's do the same thing for the country maintenance tab. That one clearly needs to be a little bit wider. Okay. So that's our first try at the navigation form. Let's close it and save the changes. The name is FRM navigation form. Click on OK. And now let's take it for a test drive. Let's double click on it in the navigation panel to open it up. There's trip maintenance. There's country maintenance. Now, as you can see, there's quite a bit of cosmetic work to do there. In trip maintenance, in the preceding section, I made the background color consistent. I need to do that in country maintenance as well. So I've come into the design of country maintenance. I've already changed that background color. I may add a form footer to this form later on, but what I am going to do is to do something about the sizes of the two forms that I'm giving people access to, because the trip maintenance form is much wider than the country maintenance form. What I'm going to do is to make them the same width, even though the country maintenance form doesn't have much information on it. And then I'm going to adjust the navigation form accordingly. So I've taken a few more steps in the direction of consistency here. I've made the country maintenance form the same width as the trip maintenance form, and I've made sure that the background color throughout is the same. Notice it also now has a form footer, and the date will be shown in there. Let me just look at trip maintenance. Again, some very similar features, same color background, etc. And I'm pretty much fixed on that width now for the constituent forms, which meant that in the navigation form itself, let's just look at the design of the navigation form itself. I've made the container that holds the alternate pages big enough to fully accommodate both of those forms, trip maintenance and country maintenance. I've also made sure that in the tab control at the top, the background is again the same color. And I've also made sure that backgrounds throughout this form are the same color. So let me close the trip maintenance form, and let me close the country maintenance form, and let's go into the navigation form in form view, and it's now looking considerably better. And if I tab between country maintenance and trip maintenance, things are improved. There's still obviously quite a bit to do, but this is a pretty good start on putting together an actual database application. Notice also that I've changed the header label on the navigation form, and the sort of thing you might do next would be to look at, say, this trip maintenance page and say, well, does it really still need to say trip maintenance there, since it says trip maintenance on the tab? And these are the sort of questions that will arise as you continue to develop your database. Now I need to do a couple of things a little bit more fundamental now, and for one of them I need to go back into the options. And in the options on the current database page there is an option, a display form. And what display form specifies is the form to open when you open a database. And what I want to do for my users is that when they open this database, I want them to see this navigation form. So I'm going to make this navigation form the form that opens when they open the database. Click on OK. Now this is one of those changes that will only take effect if I close and reopen the current database. So that's what I'm going to do now. Now clearly this would happen whether I opened it with Access already open or not. In this case Access is already open. So that's the one to open, Esprit de Tour 18, and it goes straight into my navigation form. Now much earlier on in this section I said one of the things I want to do is to be able to hide the navigation pane. I don't want users to have access to the navigation pane. So I'm going to go once again back into my database options, current database page, and down in the navigation section there's a checkbox, display navigation pane. I'm going to uncheck that. Click on OK. Once again, this is one that I need to close and reopen for. So close. And now all I see is the navigation form. Now there are a couple of other things that you can do in a slightly different way. One of them is, for instance, that you could collapse the ribbon so people don't actually see the ribbon in front of them, and in that way you're narrowing down what people are able to do. On the face of it, somebody opening this database now would just only be able to choose between those two forms. In reality, it's actually quite easy to get round many of these things if you know what you're doing. So for instance, to see the navigation pane, you just use the F11 key. Press the F11 function key and the navigation pane reappears. But you can even suppress that and stop people being able to do that. Now in order to do that, you need to look at programming code. And for instance, with things as they are, not only can they relatively easily get to the navigation pane, of course somebody that knows what they're doing could get into the options here and reset the options that we've just changed anyway. But again, it is possible to restrict, to stop people from doing that. You just need to know a little bit more about access in order to do that. So for the moment, that's the next stage of development of the Esprit de Tour database. And that's it for this section. Please join me in the next one.
To download the Microsoft Access practice exercise files and follow along, click the link right over there. To see the rest of the videos in this series, click right over there. Finally, if you're enjoying this training, please leave us a thumbs up, some comments, and don't forget to subscribe.